I think we ought to start at the beginning. Remind us, Doug, if you will, horse soldiers is all about the accomplishments of these great Special Forces soldiers working with the Northern Alliance in the earliest days. Why don't you walk us through that moment? What was the sense of mission, and how was that mission carried out?
The sense of mission in 2001, in September and October of that year, was very broad. Many of us may know that the United States' total response to those attacks of 9/11 were initially just 12 U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers tasked to land secretly in Afghanistan, link up with anti-Taliban militia fighters led by various warlords who we'd kept contact with since the Soviet withdrawal in '89. It was a broad mission. They had been trained, as Special Forces soldiers are, to work independently, to think in a network style, often being the only senior ranking American on the ground in any kind of conflict. They effected a very brilliant tactical victory in achieving in about 8 weeks what the Pentagon initially thought might take a year and a half. It's quite stunning. Bob Woodward, in one of his books, points out that this initial phase involved about 300 personnel, followed very quickly by thousands of conventional troops, about $70 million, and as I said, a very shortened time frame. Special Forces had never been used before as a lead element in any kind of deployment in United States history. And so just before I stop here, just to set the stage a bit, to think back to October of 2001, on the 19th of October, 12 of these guys land in a helicopter landing zone 60 miles south of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan. The Chinook takes off. They watch their counterparts, their indigenous counterparts, step out of the gloom dressed in rags and robes, and some not wearing shoes. This is very much a ragtag army. So the United States was the underdog, the insurgent in that fight, outnumbered and outgunned by a Taliban force that basically owned 90% of the country. So I think we'll finish this conversation today by talking about how we did so little with so much back then with so little, and how today we seem to struggle to do a whole lot with a whole lot more and may not be quite so successful.
Yeah. And of course, part of the accomplishment back then was the fact that we had a government. We had a government who was willing to serve as our target. It was a very clarifying fact.
Yeah, their mission was very broad, to go and make it. Here's what it was, for those of you who write operations orders or get them. Theirs was to make the country unsafe for the Taliban. How broad can that be? It just means don't go off the road, essentially, and don't break the law. And they did that, and what they brought to this battle was supreme close air support, which, however, it's debatable. Any bomb drop from 30,000 feet may not be technically close air support, but it was guided by these lasers they had in their rucksacks. So essentially, the early part of this war is basically a Western with lasers, because they rode horses, believe it or not, and had no wheeled vehicles to speak of.
And what was the strategic mission then? What was the purpose?
Well, to secure the country and make it unsafe as a haven for Taliban and/or slash the Al-Qaeda training camps, which had been operating there in the power vacuum, which basically had festered and grown during their previous years of civil war. I will note that when these Special Forces soldiers, joined by conventional troops as well, rode through town on horseback into these cities, Colonel Mark Mitchell at the time noted in a journal that he felt like he was back in his grandfather's time in World War II, because the locals had come out to the street and were lining the street and waving candy, throwing papers. The kids loved everybody. We had that country on our side at that time and place. It was quite a stunning moment.
And though the government was overthrown with relatively, seemingly light effort on our part, the strategic mission was not thereby accomplished at that moment, was it? It carried forward into a more ambiguous.
Yeah, the next phase would have been, cease of combat, creation of everything that makes a society. And today, the counterinsurgency strategy there is these giant rings of troops meant to protect the center in a place like Helmand Province, which Jack knows quite well. What's missing is the police force and the judiciary. If you drive in any American city and you go to the county seat, what do you see? The courthouse. We take it for granted, but the whole world really revolves around that courthouse. And those are the two, as far as I am concerned, the two missing levers in that country still. A sense of a police force which does not terrorize its own population, and a judiciary that can adjudicate land and water disputes.
Jack Segal, can we bring you in on this now and ask you for your assessment now, 10 years on? What was the strategic mission then, and where do we find ourselves today relative to it?
Well, thank you very much. I think Doug made a very interesting statement when he defined the Special Forces mission as to make the country unsafe for the Taliban. Some of you whom I've met here, I've made the point that the word Talib means student of Islam. And so a group of Talib are called Taliban. And so if we define our mission as making this place unsafe for the believers of Islam, we define the population, and particularly the male part of the population, as our enemy. That ambiguity that was built into that initial mission, we became somewhat more careful about for a while, and we began to talk about the insurgents. But more recently, we have gotten sloppy again, and we begin to talk about defeating the Taliban. And if you are a religious Muslim and you have an obligation to protect the Holy Quran and protect your religion, then you are obligated to engage in jihad, holy war, against those who would destroy your religion. So if we are not cautious about what we define as our objectives, we create such a broad spectrum of possibilities that we can manage to define everyone in the population as our enemy. That is not our intent, obviously. And if there is, in the definition, the title of this presentation, An Uncertain Future, it is really the uncertainty of, well, what future are you trying to create? And I'll tell you if you're on the right road. So the lack of clarity is a consistent problem here. The President, in March of 2009, said, our objective in Afghanistan is to disrupt, dismantle, and destroy al-Qaeda, and to prevent al-Qaeda from attacking us or our allies from Afghanistan or Pakistan. I did not hear Taliban in that mission statement, but we tend to confuse these two things. If al-Qaeda is the enemy, al-Qaeda is who attacked us, clearly. When that attack took place, the United States, through the State Department, contacted the Taliban government and said, turn over al-Qaeda to us. And they couldn't do it for religious reasons, but had they done it, we would not have attacked Afghanistan. Had they simply done that little thing, that the turnover of bin Laden and his gang to us, there would not have been a war in Afghanistan. Because we ignored what we would consider to be human rights abuses of Afghanistan forever, the whole time they were in power, which was more than 4 years. And it was only when it became a base for terrorism against us that it became our enemy. So I think we have to focus on that and say, well, what exactly are we trying to achieve as probably the real challenge ahead of us now.
Yeah. And Jack, this isn't the first time that you wondered what our mission might be and why we might be somewhere. You like Karl Marlantes, served in Vietnam, and you write about, in a piece that you wrote, talked about this moment of befuddlement. I'm here at Vietnam. I can no longer explain why we're here. Are we at that moment in Afghanistan right now?
I think it's, if you talked, I spend a lot of time with people with a lot of stars on their shoulders, so they are sure about what they're doing.